Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. This is a birthday party. I don't think they offered you birthday cake. They probably should have. Hopefully a sandwich will do. It's a very special birthday. My colleague Tano, Santos, and I, and Glenn Hubbard, would suggest to you because it's 300 years since the birth of Adam Smith. That's actually in June, but you weren't here. And so we waited until the fall to have a celebration. This event is sponsored by two groups, the Adam Smith Society, which, as you probably know, is on campuses all over the country, and the Hub here at the school, which focuses on business and society, and in particular this cone on the future of capitalism. It's also a treat for Tano and me because Adam Smith is at the center of a course we love to teach in the MBA program called Modern Political Economy that takes classical thinkers like Smith but brings them to today's business problems, a flavor of which we were going to try to give you today to celebrate the 300th and then give you a chance to ask us any questions you like. Because it's not church, if you want to come down closer, please feel free. Tano.
Yeah, so I think we should get things going by basically exploring a little bit some of the fundamental ideas of Adam Smith. There are many ideas, The Wealth of Nation and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which are his two main works. They have an enormous amount of things inside them. But to jump right in, Glenn, so let me ask you this question first and then I'll answer that question myself. If you were to highlight one idea from Adam Smith's work, what would that be? What would be that idea that like the elevator pitch when it comes to Adam Smith? Why is he important? You and I is our patron saint as economists, but why is it important?
Well, it's a great question, Tano, and I think it's important for everybody here to recall what a radical Smith was. A radical. Now, Tano and I are also radicals. You can tell by the way that we look, or
exactly.
Perhaps the way Tano does. But Smith was a radical. And his radical idea was to take the economic order of his day, which was mercantilism. And lest you think I'm talking about economic history, we're going to come back to Trumponomics and Bidenomics a little later. It's very much alive today. That was the economic order of the day. Smith said, you know what? That's all wrong. The idea of putting the sovereign at the center of the solar system and asking about trade balances and things that made the sovereign's finances work, that's not how you think about an economy. The radical idea was the way you think about an economy is all of us, is just average people. So the wealth of a nation, and also the health of a nation, was to be its ability to fund the consumption of average people, not the sovereign. So when economists talk about the size of the pie and GDP in today's terms, that's very much Smith's radicalism. That's the radicalism, though, that's well known and celebrated by business people and many politicians. But as Tano and I will talk about, there's another kind of radicalism of Smith that is less talked about, and to my mind at least even more important, and that's Smith's arguments in the theory of moral sentiments. Now, Smith is not an economist the way we would use that term today, even though he's definitely the father of our profession in economics. He was a moral philosopher. And his first book, the book he thought was his best book, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith talks a lot about a concept he emphasizes as mutual sympathy. To today's ears, think the word empathy, meaning everybody should be in the boat. So when we talk about Smith's radical ideas this afternoon, they're not just radical ideas for the size of an economy. They're an image, a classical liberal image of having everybody in that boat. What my colleague in the economics department, Ned Phelps, a Nobel laureate, calls mass flourishing. That's the radical idea. What's your radical idea?
My radical idea, yes. So let me, so I want to go deeper into one of your comments, because for me, Smith is a radical that goes beyond purely the way we have to organize our society from an economics point of view. So I want to bring you back to the great thinkers of centuries past who thought about political ordering and for whom the society is effectively anarchic unless there's some type of authority that can control the egotistical impulses of society's members. So think about those of you who have read political philosophy. You can think about people like Thomas Hobbes, whose idea is that you need a state, a leviathan, that needs to put people down in order to induce harmony in that society so productive things can happen. And along comes Adam Smith and proposes an incredibly radical idea that says, no, you don't have to do that. People pursuing their own interest is going to give you a harmonious society. The reason why you have bread on your table, the reason that you have food and shelter and clothing and so on and so forth, is precisely because the butcher, the baker, the worker working in the construction sector are thinking of their own interest, and they are willing to supply those services to you in exchange for a fair price. So out of these egotistical impulse of objectives comes a good thing, which is common and share prosperity. And this is a massive revolution, not just some wonderful insight in economics that still sustains economic science to this day. It's a remarkable insight about society and how can we organize society so that you can push that leviathan a little bit further in the background. You don't need it to be there. If you relax your hand, you, the state, and let people go about their business, you'll see many good things will come to pass, and it will create this share prosperity. So that's a fundamental insight that goes against, literally 1,000 years of political philosophy in the West that thought the only way you could organize society is by having a strong center, call it the state, making sure that you guys don't go completely anarchic on all of us and we end up in a worse possible situation. Now, as Glenn very well said, when you actually think about Smith and the Wealth of Nations, which is of course the work that we most typically associate with him, it pays to read the Theory of Moral Sentiments next to it, which was his famous book before the Wealth of Nations, by the way. And it was widely read, widely discussed, and it's kind of a nice counterbalance to many of the ideas in the Wealth of Nations, because if you go back to what I just told you, right, he says, Smith has this beautiful idea that if we go about our business, right, good things are going to happen because people are going to act on their economic interest. And by the way, this has a name in economics. It's called the first welfare theorem. A competitive equilibrium is socially efficient. If you go about your business and do your thing in the market, you get the social optimum. So there's an idea that economists have been working on for the last 300 years, since essentially Smith already had an intuition of that result. But Smith understood more than that. That's kind of the beauty of Adam Smith and the depth of his thought process. He understood that, this way of organizing society can be quite impersonal sometimes, right? If we relate to each other, we relate to each other simply through the price mechanism, we would all agree that this would be a, kind of a cold existence, right? So if the only way I relate to Glenn is as a co-worker that we're linked by a common production function to produce services to you guys and interesting lectures, and that's about it, it would be a pretty boring interaction we would have, and Glenn would be, very sad and grumpy as a result because he would miss my wonderful sense of humor, okay? So Theory of Moral Sentiments is about that other layer of human interaction, right? And Glenn did exactly the right thing by emphasizing, by the way, you read the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the first chapters are all about sympathy and empathy. That's the first thing he wants to tell you, that this is not going to work unless you're able to relate to the other. And he's very much aware that this is a non-market transaction. And no markets, no prices, no nothing in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's really about how we connect to each other as people, and how can we build a society beyond that economic transaction that is based on mutual empathy and respect to each other.
Can I pick up on that, because as Tano was talking, he emphasized that one of the core ideas in the Wealth of Nations is the familiar invisible hand. In econ speak, it's really just competition. Now, to see Smith as the radical, you have to understand, while competition may be an early chapter in your freshman economics textbook, it certainly wasn't in Smith's day. In Smith's day, he spends time railing against the British East India Company, the big monopoly that the British Crown had granted on the Indian subcontinent. He talks about the guild system that made it harder for workers to get new jobs. He's very much for competition. What makes all of that almost Swiss watch-like mechanism that Tano described work is competition. Where I think at least the theory of moral sentiments comes in is it's not just this impersonal process of competition, as Tano was outlining, it's also the ability to compete, that you don't have mass flourishing without the ability to compete. In our course, we talk about a tension, maybe we can come to during the time together, between later thinkers in the 20th century, like Hayek, who is Nobel Prize winner in economics, also from the liberal tradition, but what economists might call neoliberal, much more for the impersonal market that Tano talked about, versus Polanyi, another thinker whose classic book actually comes out the same year as Hayek's book, also talking much more about community relations. But all of these roll back up to Smith.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a beautiful segue into the larger themes of the modern political economy class, right? So later thinkers, so I personally think that Smith is very, very much misunderstood in a way that is often quoted and rarely read. And this, by the way, already happened in his own time. Basically, if you follow how Smith was processed by contemporaries, first they had great difficulty in understanding what he meant to say. And, Smith, as Glenn was saying at the very beginning, is a revolutionary. He's ushering a new way of thinking. So it's not surprising that, many, fellow political economists, politicians who were trying to, what can I get out of this guy that I can use politically? It took some time for people to process those ideas. And yesterday, by the way, at night when I was, relaxing a little bit and thinking about this event, I decided to read a very interesting article about how French thinkers in the turn of the 19th century read Smith. And of course, you can imagine that given the statist kind of tradition or political tradition of France, it took some, processing to incorporate Smith into their thinking. But in that sense, one topic that plays a prominent role in our class is precisely what a market does to society. This is a very profound question. Smith didn't touch on that question. He thought the market is good and we should have empathy for each other. That's kind of the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments. How to put those things together is important. And a lot of the debates that we have today have to do with, well, wait a minute. You're thinking this is a quintessential economist idea. Okay, if you talk with an economist, they think, no, you can have empathy and you can have markets, and these two things are orthogonal to each other. Many thinkers will tell you, no, that's not how it works. You introduce the market, you change the set of social relations between members of society, and that's going to interfere with perhaps something that those members of the society value a lot. So, for instance, let me give you an example of this that features prominently in our class. Free trade is good. Now, the problem is that free trade comes about and it destroys a local industry, perhaps disrupting severely socially and economically a community where people would have to leave, go to other places. Maybe there will be problems of unemployment, of exclusion, whatever it is. We'll discuss those things at length in the class when we meet to discuss those issues. And then you have to think, well, the market is good, right? You open international trade, comparative advantage at work. Production flows to that country that is best equipped to produce that. And there's a cost. There's a cost to that particular community that was producing X. Now X is being produced elsewhere. Do we care about that? That's a little bit one of the big discussions that we have to this day about the role of markets in society, and how, as society policymakers, you've been very much involved in policy, Glenn, we navigate that trade-off.
Well, let me pursue that with you, because 2 weeks ago, The Economist, which I hope everybody reads every week, featured a title about "Are Free Markets Dead?" And the thesis was really on industrial policy, with which Smith would not have had, it's not that he would have no sympathy for the argument, but relatively little. It's very hot topic today. Tano, we should each give our perspective, but let me just start with you. Why is that? Why are we seeing a resurgence of industrial policy, despite the fact of the cogency of Smith's arguments and other classical liberal arguments?
Yeah, I think it has to do with what we just brought up, that in a way, it's precisely because these shocks that have been induced by these two forces that we have unleashed after the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s have produced social dislocations, and that has a political consequence and a backlash. So, and this is not new. I mean, it has happened before in history, and you have to apportion appropriately the responsibility of each of these two shocks, technology and open trade. But the one that is visible and the one that is kind of most salient in our discussion today is the open trade one, even though I don't know where we are now in our estimates of how much of the employment reduction in manufacturing is accounted for.
It's really technology. The
exactly.
Classic case that protectionists point to is the domestic steel industry, but by far the bigger disruptor of steel in the United States was the advent of new technologies. And steelmaking, in fact, if you built a wall around the United States, you wouldn't change the bulk of the dislocation. Yeah. And I do think you're right, Tano. I think what's different about today, remember Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759. He wrote it before what we all might call contemporary industrial capitalism. It wasn't a thing at that point. Later thinkers are picking up on Smith, and early capitalists certainly celebrated Smith, but Smith wasn't writing for that world. Yeah. So in Smith's world, change happened very gradually. And if I got a different job, it's because one unskilled occupation isn't so good, so I'll pursue another unskilled occupation. It's not what we're talking about today. What's different today is not just the source of the shocks. As Tano said, I think very correctly, it's technological change number one, and then globalization. But it's some other factors, like their speed. The speed of change, think right now what's happening in artificial intelligence, but each wave of general purpose technology, of which AI is an example, has come faster and faster in the 20th and the 21st century. The second is how persistent those changes are. So they don't come and go. And the third, at least for our political system, something we talk about in class, is how geographically concentrated they tend to be. And in many political systems, geographic concentration matters for democracy.
Yeah, so I was going to emphasize this third point, that one of the things that is very different from Smith's time to our own is the aspect of political representation, right? I mean, in the time of Smith, a lot of these decisions were taken, Kingdom at that time was democracy, but it was not our mass democracies, let's put it this way. And political representation was very unevenly distributed across political groups. So you could actually implement particular policies, and some of the people who were going to be most affected by the effects of those policies were not politically represented. And we discussed in class, when we have a bit of fun with this, tracking down the passage of the Corn Laws and how political weights were changing as a result of this.
Okay, let's do a jargon check. Corn Laws.
Corn Laws, yeah, sorry.
Were protectionist legislation in the United Kingdom in the early 19th century.
Yes, sorry.
And they were designed, basically it's a classic political economy story because it's agricultural interests that were the incumbents, think aristocrats who owned lots of land, versus the new manufacturing capitalists.
Yeah,
so now
exactly. And whereas now, whatever changes we're going to be seeing, including, by the way, so we see a lot of political discussion around, say, our commercial relations with China and other countries, right? So that's very salient, it's very much in the political debate, and the reason why it's more heated than it was in, say, Smith's time. By the way, 10 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, France and England enter into one of the great commercial treatises of the history of commercial treatises, which is the Eden treaty, which was all about technology transfers, okay? So some of these things were already being discussed by the political establishment, but of course, completely absent is the effect that these agreements would have on employment and prosperity in local communities. This is what is very different today. And by the way, it's very different, not just about trade, it's going to be very different about technology, because a lot of these technological innovations that we're going to be experiencing for the next few years, if not decades, are going to affect groups, workers, who are there alert politically and are going to react politically to the effects that technology is going to have on employment. We typically think about, say, blue-collar workers producing cars or producing some type of manufacturing commodity out there, but the technology changes that are coming our way are mostly going to affect services. It's going to be very interesting to see how politically that's going to play out as technology starts taking away and eating away some of those service-related jobs. So,
yeah, I mean, what if ChatGPT could teach modern political economy?
What is going to happen?
There are these things. So you mentioned sort of a let-it-alone view of government before, laissez-faire.
Laissez-faire.
And is it fair? I mean, a lot of business people, particularly conservative thinkers, will point to Smith and call him laissez-faire and say that if you believe in the wealth of nations, you're laissez-faire and government should just get out of the way. Certainly neoliberal thinkers in the 20th century, like two Nobel laureates, Friedman and Hayek, definitely went much more down that road. Is it fair to put Smith there?
No. I think it's, one of the things that, you said something before that is spot on, that Smith has been canonized as the patron saint of capitalism, but his views are very nuanced. And in particular, one of the big things in him, if you read at the end of the first volume, starts talking about there are some things in which, we can go in and tweak them because they're important for the defense of the nation. Okay, so the Navy was a big thing for him. This thing of letting others who may have an advantage in building ships may be very dangerous because we're a seafaring nation. We cannot depend on other countries to perhaps supply those means of transportation that are essential for England, given that those countries may eventually be our enemies. So we may want to actually protect this industry. And by the way, he was very sophisticated about it. So if you read carefully what he says, it's not only important to keep, the production of these ships in the United Kingdom, we have to train crews and we have to make sure we have enough human capital in order to actually make sure these people are good at doing what they're supposed to be doing. So Smith has a very nuanced view, by the way. We're going to get to talk about this when we discuss, some of the things that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have done with semiconductors in China. Are we comfortable sharing particular technologies with countries with whom we may have an adversarial relation further down the road? So Smith was very much on top of that, and he said, well, that's a choice you will have to make, and you will have to be careful how to actually allocate decision rights over those decisions, whether you want to allocate it to the market or whether you want to allocate it to the state itself. And what we've seen, those of you who follow the news closely on these matters, is that, when it comes to these matters of national security, countries always go one way. The market, this is too important to let the market adjudicate who should be producing war-making ships or who should be producing semiconductors. It's just too important, okay? So that heavy-handedness that, we have seen when it comes to these technology transfers also, played a role in Smith's time. If I can add one more thing, I was mentioning before the Eden Treaty of 1786 between France and England. English commentators who had read Smith basically said, are we sure we're comfortable having the French get all these technologies that we have, all these machines, what they call the spinning jenny or whatever
spinning
it's called.
jenny.
The spinning jenny, all those things that the British were producing at the time that were technologically superior to the French? Are we comfortable having this French industrialists import all these machines to France? Maybe we'll come back to hunt us. Boy, were they right? 10 years later, France and England are in a major war during the Napoleonic times. So that's one aspect where Smith was very clear.
I agree with that. I think that for Smith, the notion of laissez-faire really is misplaced. Smith had very strong roles, to take it in contemporary economic terms, for the state in providing public goods. So that would be defense, infrastructure, the court system, education. I would argue if you overlay the theory of moral sentiments onto Smith's arguments, everything I just said is from Wealth of Nations, but if you layer it on top, I think it's very much about ordinary people's ability to compete in society as well. Those are essential state functions, I think, in Smith's view, where liberalism, which is Smith and other classical thinkers like Ricardo, fade away, is more in the 20th century. Friedman, Hayek are very much sort of markets as a kind of sola scriptura, and that is really not where Smith started. Another thing that's important for Smith is competition. What makes this economy work, what gets the pie to be as big as possible, what provides this mass flourishing is competition. Smith was very cynical about business people. He didn't know about MBAs, so he wasn't directly cynical about you, but he was cynical about business people because he said, whenever there's a group of business people gathered together, it's probably, I don't remember the exact words, but conniving to cheat the public, price fixing and things like that. So Smith was very focused on competition, and I would guess if he were here today, I doubt he would be a Lena Khan fan, but he might very well support competition.
There's a name we haven't brought up, and I think we need to bring him up, and it's Marx, and how he stands in relation to Adam Smith.
It's so interesting because people think of Smith and Marx as these countervailing forces. Marx very much is building on Smith.
Yeah.
In fact, Marx had enormous admiration for the economy that Smith talked about as a machine for generating wealth. Marx did. There were some technical differences between Marx and Smith that are important, like how does technological change affect workers? That's a very big difference between the two men, although neither had it quite right.
Right. But Marx had it more right. No, at least he was,
But where Marx, I think, still speaks to today, and why I think it's important to bring Smith back over just contemporary neoliberal thinkers, is the idea of alienation in society. That something can happen, even in a very powerful wealth-generating machine like the one Smith described, that leads to political economy instability. Marx's mechanisms weren't right, but that point, I think, speaks to us. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah, Marx, you brought the concept of alienation, which is a super important concept in Marxist thought, obviously. And, just to be clear on what he meant by that, right? We are workers in a factory, we're producing whatever product it is. Somehow our labor is embedded in that piece of production, but it's not ours. It belongs to the owner of the capital. So when it's taken away from you, you're alienated from your labor. And you may want to, or we may want to explore, it's kind of one of those things that one is better discussing with copious quantities of alcohol. To what extent that concept, can be transferred to today's society somehow, that, we are part of society, we contribute to society as students, as faculty, as administrators, you name it, and somehow you feel you don't have agency nonetheless. And that, somehow these things are happening to you, and even though you're working hard towards a particular goal or you've been a good member of society, you're alienated from society at large because you feel your agency doesn't count. And that's an important idea, that somehow when you, and I think it's something that we need to explore as economists and social scientists, right? That when you open the market and you open society to all sorts of shocks, to all sorts of influences, many people are going to feel, as if they did not have agency. And that's I think, Glenn,
Yeah, I agree.
going back to something that you asked me before, I think one of the reasons for this surge in populism is basically a reaction to the effects of particular policies that were put in place that have transformed societies, in many cases for the better, or in many dimensions for the better, but at the same time have dramatically altered the feel of society for many of those individuals in a way in which they feel they have no say whatsoever, and I mean there are many examples of these, and where those where that sense of alienation led to very striking political decisions like Brexit that we will discuss in class.
Well, one of the things that we talk about in class is the rise of contemporary populism, which could either be, at least in the American setting, the sort of protectionist strain that we've seen, but also resort to old-style industrial policy ideas. And a lot of that does come, at least we would argue, from the idea that while markets work very well and technological advance and globalization have improved lives on average, just like your Econ 101 professor told you, there are a lot of distributional consequences that our system simply hasn't addressed very well. And if we don't address them, they come out in these perhaps less healthy political forces. Whereas if Smith were here today, he might say, well, wait, we have a couple of different things we could do. We could go general or go specific. We could go general and say, well, why don't we subsidize research? Why don't we subsidize education and training? Or go specific. If there's some narrow areas, like the Navy example Tano gave, maybe we do that, but maybe we don't do anything more. I think these contemporary political trends, not just in the US, but around the world, really come from this. Indeed, something just mentioned that we talk about in class, Karl Polanyi has already come up in the idea of market and social relations. In a society, while a market can allocate goods and services for the state, depending on your choice, there are important relations each of us has as an individual with the market and with society. And if you were to think like neoliberals think of particular property rights in market, you could almost think of as those relations as a kind of right. Yet when the market tramples those rights, people get upset. So it's interesting, when Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944, it became a big hit, largely because it was serialized in Reader's Digest. It was a very big deal. That's not why Hayek won the Nobel Prize, but it is what put Hayek on the map. Polanyi did not get in Reader's Digest, and his book, The Great Transformation, which I think both of us would argue is just as powerful,
it's very powerful.
Didn't get that attention, but really should. And a lot of what we try to do in class is either reincarnate Smith by celebrating his birthday every 300 years or so, or bringing together more contemporary thinkers like Hayek and Polanyi and say, if you put the two of them together, they weren't, but if you put the two of them together, they're bringing Smith back. I don't know what he would.
Yeah, so I want to react to one thing. Something important when you talk with economists, people like Glenn, myself, Ray Horton, who was a person who designed originally modern political economy, is a political scientist. We economists have like a particular way of seeing the world, right? That we see, a dispute, a conflict, a disagreement or something, we think, if property rights are well defined, then you should see the efficient outcome. And one party should pay the other if he cares more about the outcome of that particular disagreement, and kumbaya, everything goes through, right? And one of the things that I think I've learned, Glenn, over the last, I would say, decade and a half since the global financial crisis, is that idealized image that we have of social relations as economists, right? Somehow it doesn't quite work. I'm sure the political scientists and philosophers and sociologists would not, would have, or would say, I told you so type of thing. So we've been living through kind of the revenge of politics over the last few years, right? Of how the political system can adjudicate the grievances and the distributional outcomes of particular economic policies. And this is something that we try very hard to do in modern political economy, to think about those tensions and how they play out in the political realm, and how they get adjudicated in society. So that's going to be this is still ongoing, because if you thought the shocks that we had in the past were big, you ain't seen nothing yet. The shocks are going to be even bigger. And you're going to be called, by the way, as business school students, and when you become managers, to actually navigate the social consequences of those massive shocks that are coming your way. We're going to be seeing them, Glenn and I are going to be seeing them from a comfortable retirement, hopefully in the far distant future, but you're going to be dealing with those shocks yourself when you go and work in those organizations. So the topics are alive and well, and the issues are going to become much hotter.
Yeah, just a quick commercial. What Tano just said is the subject of a conference we're having in the Hub on the morning of November 10th, talking about what that world is going to look like, ranging from markets in the state to the treatment of workers to privacy, and some discussions with business leaders. So it'll be here at CBS. I hope you can come. One thing I would just say, because I know we want to turn to questions, is, Columbia Business School actually has had a tie to Adam Smith, largely because of our colleague, Ray Horton. Ray had visited Adam Smith's gravesite, which was in grave disrepair. At the time, I was the dean, and if you're the dean, you know lots of rich people. And so I said, we will provide rich people to pay for the refurbishment of Adam Smith's gravesite. Local fathers, horrified at that, have refurbished it because of Ray's efforts and because of Columbia Business School. So we have a small link to Adam Smith. So we could talk all day, and will if you don't, but we're going to open it up to questions from anybody.
Anything that comes to mind.
Anything on your mind. Sir, I don't know if we have mics or
you can scream.
Okay.
And we can hear you.
That's fine. Thanks for taking the time. Interesting conversation. You opened with a little bit about that first book Adam Smith wrote about society and how people relate to each other. I feel like today it's a common topic how divided we are into these different silos. In business school, we've seen case studies where that makes sense. Targeting one population gets you more like engagement. So there's a business reason for it. How do you see this playing out long term, and what would Adam say about this sort of segmentation across society?
Well, I think it's a great question, and the theory of moral sentiments really did stress this notion of empathy and keeping everybody in the same boat for general social concerns. So if you map that into today's political questions, it would be trying to be cognizant of people who are affected adversely, either by a change itself or by a policy. It's not literally the idea that if you won and I lost, that you write me a check, but that collectively as a society, we try to make sure everybody has an equal opportunity. And that's, I think, what Smith would say we're failing at. When we talk about Hayek and Polanyi in class, Hayek, it's not that Hayek didn't like people, I'm sure he did, but he was very focused just on the efficiency gains from the market itself. One thing that both of us should have said, but I'll say now, is each one of these great thinkers should be judged by the time and place in which he or she lives. So if you think Hayek is reacting to, when he thinks of the state, he thinks of Nazi Germany. When Smith is thinking of a political system run amok, he's thinking of the British East India Company and the Guild. So each time you read somebody, don't take them out of history and plop them today. Right. But I do think that Smith would speak to us from the theory of moral sentiments, and certainly the Polanyi-Hayek marriage, if I might, would. I don't know what you would say.
Yeah, so, I recommend, reading the theory of moral sentiments. It takes some time commitment, but I recommend in particularly the first chapters, because one of the things he does, and he, to start understanding individual relations, is it's basically the idea you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You won't be able to do it perfectly, but you really have to try. That's the beginning of empathy, that you have to, think of the way he's thinking, and why is he thinking what he's thinking? Why is he feeling what he's feeling? And that idea will get you a long way in understanding everybody's motivations. That's a wonderful advice, by the way, in life in general, that it will give you an enormous advantage in any situation you're dealing with, even in adversarial situations. Think, why is he doing, or why is he or she doing what he or she is doing? What is driving those particular actions, and it will give you a competitive advantage from a strategic point of view, but also in more standard situations, just simply understand what the other side is coming from, where are they coming from, okay? And that's something we've completely lost. But yesterday I was reviewing a little bit some of my favorite quotes from Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I think it's apropos your question, so I want to read it, if you allow me 1 second. I don't know where, I forgot to write the page number, but it's somewhere in the book. I have it like a little things in red, in blue, in green. I have no idea what those color coding means, but anyway, this caught my eye last night. Society, and very much apropos the very distraught days that we're living through, right? Society and conversation, therefore, are the most powerful remedies for restoring the mind to its tranquility, if at any time it has unfortunately lost it, as well as the best preservative of that equal and happy temper which is so necessary to self-satisfaction and enjoyment. So do it. Try to understand where the other one is coming from, not simply to improve that relation with that other member of society, your community, your coworker, whoever that, your competitor in the market, whoever that person is, but also it's because it will bring you happiness, self-enjoyment, as he puts it, okay? So that's a very powerful idea.
How many of you, or have any of you been on the CBS trips, like to Youngstown, Ohio, and other places? Anybody?
Oh, what a pity.
Oh, then you should. And the premise of those trips was exactly the theory of moral sentiments. It was to put yourself in someone else's shoes rather than just having white wine and shrimp toast with people who look just like you.
Yeah.
So do consider those trips. Other questions? Yeah, sir.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. You mentioned sources of shock and how it's geographically dispersed. How much do you think that the problems we're facing in the country are due to the abandonment of federalism, the concentration of power in the executive, and really the inertia of a federal government and how they make decisions with a lack of conviction across policies?
Well, it's a great
question. You take it. You were the policymaker.
I would just say in little parts. I would say the federal government is too strong and too weak. And so many of the interventions that are needed, whether it's place-based aid, changes in social insurance, those really are federal functions. But states really could be much more of a laboratory, so to wit, putting applied research centers around the country. And one of the greatest innovations in American economic policy for growth was in the 19th century, the land-grant colleges. Federal support, federal block grant in today's terms, goes to states to build colleges that really help the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. So I think states can, and there was a lot of state heterogeneity that led to their success. I do think states can play a very valuable role and have it, but I don't think we can let the federal government off the hook. The political dysfunction at the federal level has to deeply concern us. And indeed, if you don't have to have too many minutes with any senior business person, and top of his or her mind is this exact problem to deal with. I don't know what you would say.
So two reactions immediately to that. The first one is, something is striking. For those of us who read Democracy in America when we were teenagers and fell in love with the promise of America and democracy in America, one of the things that is most striking about this America of the last 30 years, which is now most of my adult life, is the disappearance of local politics, the nationalization of politics throughout, that everything has become a national conversation. So this to me is problematic because it tends to, and I think it has to do with these big shocks that somehow many in our society feel that the shocks that are affecting their day-to-day life are shocks that are huge, technology or trade, which they're not in themselves local, they have local effects, but they're not local in nature. We enter into trade agreements with China, we allow China into the WTO, say, and that's bound to have an aggregate effect on the US economy. Technology is something that affects us all, independently of where we are located. So naturally that has reoriented the political individual towards whoever is making the decisions regarding those big shocks that are having such a first-order effect in my life. There's something else too, by the way, which is, It's not that we don't know many of these things. You talk about this in class, and there's something that you say in class that I like very much. I always forget the name of this policy that we put in the 60s, trade assistance.
Trade adjustment assistance.
Exactly. Trade adjustment. I don't know how you can remember all these things, but it's basically a policy from the 60s that was put in place to assist those that would essentially suffer an unemployment spell on account of trade. Okay, international trade, that, somehow, this production no longer takes place in Ohio because it's now being done in China. Say, well, you have the right to some type of assistance because we realize this shock, which may be welfare improving for the entire country, affects you in a particular negative way. It's remarkable to me that policy has been in place for 40 years and has made no difference whatsoever.
Only 2 people in a chicken have benefited from trade. That's the problem. You can't just put policies in place without real teeth to do it.
Exactly.
But to your question about federalism, it's not that there are not regions of the country that haven't gotten this right. So I mentioned Youngstown as a struggling region. Pittsburgh is a relatively successful place. Pittsburgh and Youngstown both face similar shocks. They're not that far apart. Yet Pittsburgh was able to mobilize local economic leaders, local business leaders, and say, we got to diversify and change this economy, and they did. Compare Massachusetts, post the failure of the mills, to southern states that tried to use protectionism to protect the mills. Look at the change in prosperity. So different regions do get this right. And a lot of what politicians should be doing is trying to look across the country, wherever there's a success story, and say, what did those local business people and politicians do? And can we replicate that?
Yeah, so I want to emphasize this, absolutely, this gap in instruments and shocks. That the instruments are distributed in a particular way between national governments. It's just not a problem of the United States, by the way, it's a problem in Europe too, for instance, between national governments and, say, the local administrative units, the regions or the states in the United States. So that gap is very difficult to navigate in the presence of these large shocks, very difficult to navigate.
Other questions on your mind? Sir.
How do you think that Adam Smith would react to the work of Thomas Piketty and the view that, if you let the market work, you'll have accumulation of capital and that leads to social tension? How do you think he would react to that?
One of the things that you have to understand about Adam Smith, there are comments about inequality in Smith, by the way, and in particular in relation to policies. So he has this wonderful passage in The Wealth of Nations that I always use when I'm in Europe, because he starts talking the way only an Englishman can talk, or he was not an Englishman, he was a Scot. A British, say, can talk about Europe. He refers to the continent as Europe because, of course, the United Kingdom, as you know, and as you may notice, is not part of Europe. But the way he thinks about inequality, has to be precise about what Smith talks about, it is the effect that particular ill-conceived policies have on inequality. So he was very worried on these issues of capture, that somehow you would use the instruments of the state to redirect rents your way. Absent that, one important thing to understand is that it took a long time for economists to understand the connection between market outcomes and issues of income inequality. That's not there until certainly Ricardo starts talking about some of those issues, certainly Marx starts talking about those issues, but it took a little bit for people to start hitting on this, and not in a way you're thinking about it right now, right? And so Thomas Piketty, together with Emmanuel Saez, is all about what is going on with wealth and income distributions. They have been getting more and more skewed. Fewer and fewer are accumulating a larger percentage of wealth. Why is that the case? And that's where your point about the rate of return on capital. If you own capital, then that's it. You're going to end up with a lot of the wealth in a particular society. Smith has very little to say about that.
The only two things he does, he criticizes luxuries and consumption of luxuries by the rich. I don't remember the exact words he used, but they're not polite. And then he's very much a fan of progressive taxation. Without literally using those those words.
But he doesn't link progressive taxation to problems of
Right.
inequality.
Well,
which
he
is the
didn't
one.
see the levels of inequality that he saw. Remember, he's writing before the big industrial fortunes
Yeah.
are made. I have time for another, yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciated your comments and discussion on the concept of agency.
On?
Agency.
Agency. I recently spoke to a prominent hedge fund manager in Asia. He made the argument that in politics in America, on the right, they view generally that people in the United States have all the agency they need to bring about social mobility. And those on the left, they almost approach things as if they have no agency whatsoever. And thus they need a lot of government assistance and so forth. What are your views on this? Do you think it's correct or incorrect?
I mean, this is a classic in political philosophy, right? If you know, it's if
We
you
have a whole class on this.
devoted to
actually,
this, yeah.
all day on this very subject.
on this very topic, you know. But you know, if you haven't read, I always, you know, two concepts of liberty.
Berg.
No, Isaiah Berlin. Berlin's two concepts.
Oh,
of-
Isaiah Berlin, yeah.
Yeah, Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of freedom or two concepts of liberty. I always forget whether he uses one word or the other. I very much recommend it because you just describe in a nutshell, you know, this fundamental idea that, you know, very briefly, liberty for someone from the left means something that, what it means for someone from the right. So liberty for someone from the left is, I look at you and I see, well, you're cold, you're hungry, you're not healthy, so you're not free because you're oppressed by this hunger, by this cold, by this, lack of health, by your condition, so I have to act on you. I have to give you these necessities of life because only once you have those, you will be free, right?
And then I look at you and say, pull your socks up, get
Exactly.
a job. So you have these two different
There's two different,
poles,
right?
but I think the reason that simple adage that you had in the conversation isn't quite spot on for what we're dealing with today is agency means my taking on idiosyncratic action, but if a lot of what is affecting people are forces beyond their control, globalization, technological change are among them, you cannot expect a single individual to solve that, even with all the agency in the world. But it doesn't follow that you should just put everybody on the dole either. So I don't think either one of those is the answer. We think probably this Hayek-Polanyi or go all the way back to Smith answer of give people opportunity.
Exactly. It's like the fundamental problem of collective action is create the conditions so you have agency. You know what I mean? Like, to create a set of institutions, so you can actually do your own thing and express yourself and be the master of your own destiny. And it's that balance which is at the heart of the political debates today. And, it's not the first time, we're having debates, for those of you who are into intellectual history, they have a certain cyclicality to them, which is always the relation between the state and the individual. And we fluctuate between these two things depending on when do these two things get a little bit out of whack. And that's kind of the debate that we're having today. But that's a classic, and it pays to think through the historical experience that we've had in the past, but also the intellectual history of these ideas. Why did great thinkers think about that balance one way or another at a particular point in time?
Let me ask, because our time's about out, do a quick lightning round. So earlier this year, Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor in the White House, gave a speech at the Brookings Institution on Washington on Bidenomics and industrial policy. And he said, the classical liberal ideas are just going to have to fall away. This is all about industrial policy. We're talking about Adam Smith's 300th birthday today. Are we going to be talking about Adam Smith 300 years from now or even 10 years from now? What do you think?
Oh, I think we will. One way you can read Adam Smith, Adam Smith, sometimes actually when you read it, you can become a little bit frustrated in the middle of the book. Let me just say that from the very beginning, because he's talking about these broader principles. And sometimes you would like that kind of a practical example that would bring the point home. But Adam Smith is trying to give you a framework to think about particular issues and reminding you of a very powerful idea the idea with which we started, which is, hey, you let people do their own thing, good things may come of that, even though it doesn't look like it. Out of that, quote unquote, anarchy, good outcomes may occur. that idea, which is so powerful, is not going to go away, in my opinion. We're going to be talking about these. We're discussing where to put the line in that balance we were discussing just a minute ago, but we're going to be talking about that. Now, I would just say one thing, and to finish with one name that hasn't come up, I think, today, which is that of Keynes. Because Keynes had this wonderful idea that the economic predicament of man is not its permanent condition, that eventually we will solve this problem. So one of the things that may happen is that we address some of the pressing economic issues. So we will talk less of Smith because, we may have solved some of the social problems of wealth generation and distribution. So
I remind you that Keynes told that story in 1930, so we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of this supposed
so we'll
advent.
have another one,
we
yeah.
will be talking about Smith.
So
Thanks for joining this birthday party. It's a real treat. We're going to let you get to your day. And if these kinds of topics interest you, conference November 10th, Modern Political Economy happens beginning in January, and a sister course on business and society in the B term in the spring. Thanks, enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.